Detective Max Rivera watched the trial from the back row. The room was filled to capacity journalists, sympathizers, the curious. But no one stood out as much as she did, a petite woman with brown hair gathered into a neat ponytail. Linda Coleman sat on the edge of the bench, staring up at the judge. Her posture read everything: hope, despair, determination. Rivera knew that look. In 15 years on the Harris County Police Force, he had seen many women who were certain of their husband's innocence. Usually their faith was quickly shattered by hard evidence. But Linda's case was special. For 2 years, she had fought tirelessly for a retrial of Robert Coleman, convicted of an armed robbery of a gas station that left an employee badly wounded. "Those present, please rise," announced the bailiff, and all rose. Judge Margaret Dawson, known for her strictness, gave the room a cold stare. Rivera watched as Linda clenched her hands so tightly that her knuckles turned white. In the case of the state of Texas vs. Robert James Coleman, the court has decided to grant the motion for reconsideration due to new circumstances, the judge said measuredly. In view of the evidence presented by the defense, inconsistencies in the testimony of a key witness, and the results of the retrial, the verdict of the previous trial is reversed. The defendant, Robert James Coleman, is released from custody in the courtroom. Linda let out a strangled shriek. Rivera saw tears streaming down her cheeks as Robert was led out the side door. He was pale after 3 years in prison, but he was smiling. Linda rushed to him, wrapped her arms around his neck, and the hall erupted in applause. Rivera frowned. His police sense said something was wrong here. The reunion seemed too theatrical, Robert's smile too strained. But no one seemed to notice. Journalists had already surrounded the couple. Camera flashes were flashing from all sides. "Linda, what are your plans now?" shouted someone from the crowd of reporters. "To return to normal life," she answered, not letting go of her husband's hand. 3 years of nightmare behind her. The truth had prevailed. Rivera quietly left the room. He wasn't an investigator on the Coleman case, but he remembered the details. The evidence seemed irrefutable. Camera footage, fingerprints, witness testimony. What could go wrong? Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. 2 weeks before the trial, Rivera met Linda Coleman in person for the first time. It was at the Houston Public Library, where she came every Tuesday and Thursday after working at the elementary school where she taught 3rd graders. He spotted her at a far table surrounded by stacks of papers and old newspaper clippings. "Mrs. Coleman?" he asked quietly, stepping closer. She flinched and raised her head. The dark circles under her eyes showed chronic sleep deprivation, but her eyes remained clear and determined. "Detective Rivera," she said, asserting rather than asking. "I know who you are. Saw you in court. May I sit down?" She gestured to the chair across from her. "I wasn't working on your husband's case," Rivera began. "I'm just, interested." "You mean you doubt his innocence like everyone else?" Linda said sharply, slamming one of the folders shut. "I'm sorry, Detective, but I don't have time to convince another skeptic." "That's not why I'm here," Rivera objected calmly. "I'm trying to understand." Something in his tone made her soften. "What exactly do you want to understand? What makes you so sure?" The evidence was strong. Linda grinned bitterly and pulled a tattered notebook out of her bag. "Here!" She opened it to a page with a timeline of events written in small, neat handwriting. Robert was supposed to be in Austin the night of the robbery. It was our wedding anniversary, and I waited for him to call me from the Magnolia Hotel at 9 p.m. He did. We talked for 17 minutes. There's even phone records to prove it. Which could have been made by anyone on his phone, Rivera noted. At 10:30, a payment was made for dinner at the hotel restaurant with his credit card. There's a signature. Forgery? At 11:45, the hotel camera caught him going back to his room, and the robbery happened in Houston at 10:15. It's physically impossible to be in 2 places at once, even on an airplane. Rivera thought for a moment. The argument was a strong one. So why had the prosecution ignored these facts? Because the hotel camera footage was not preserved due to a technical error. The hotel confirmed the stay, but without video evidence, and the prosecution argued that someone else could have used his card. They were so sure it was Robert on the gas station tape. Linda rubbed her temples. But it's not him. Robert has a birthmark on his neck, clearly visible. It doesn't show up on the tape. I tried to explain, but who would listen to a wife? What's changed now? There's a witness. A bartender at a restaurant in Austin remembers Robert. He remembered him because Robert ordered a rare whiskey for a special occasion. Plus, I found another recording from an ATM near the hotel where Robert withdrew money at 11:30. Rivera nodded. That explained the turn of events, but something still bothered him. He'd seen the crime scene photos, seen the wounded teller. The robbery wasn't typical. It bore the mark of personal revenge or spite. You lived with your husband for how long? 7 years before his arrest, Linda answered, and there was warmth in her eyes. We met in college. I was a teacher. He was an engineer. Did he ever show any aggression? Rivera asked, watching her reaction carefully. For a split second, her gaze clouded over, but she quickly collected herself. Never. Robert is the gentlest person I know. He couldn't hurt anyone. Rivera thought of his ex-wife, who always claimed he worked too hard. The gentlest man was a characterization she would never apply to him. Why would anyone want to set your husband up? He asked one last question. Linda stacked the papers in a neat stack. That's exactly what I can't understand, Detective. Who would do that? Robert has no enemies. Unless, She hesitated. What? Nothing. Just stupid thoughts. She stood up. I should go. I have an early start tomorrow. I have a third-grade art class. Rivera watched her carefully put the papers into a large bag. There was something she wasn't telling him, but all people have secrets, and Rivera had no official authority to question her further. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. On the day of Robert Coleman's release, the newspapers ran headlines like, Innocent Man Serves 3 Years, Justice Triumphs in Houston, Love and Faith, the Linda Coleman Story. TV stations showed footage of their reunion over and over again. Rivera was reviewing these news stories in his office when Sarah Johnson, Linda's friend who had helped her campaign for Robert's release, knocked on the door. May I? She asked, looking around nervously. Sure, Rivera pointed to a chair. What can I do for you? Sarah fidgeted nervously with the strap of her bag. I know you were interested in Robert's case. Linda told me about your meeting. She paused, searching for words. I'm worried about her. Rivera set aside the papers he was looking at. Why? I've known Linda since college. She's always been, idealistic. Only sees the good in people. Sarah swallowed. When Robert was arrested, she refused to believe. Then she devoted herself to proving his innocence. We all helped, but she was the only one so obsessed. And now you're afraid it was all for nothing? That he's really guilty? I don't know, Sarah admitted honestly. But I remember Robert before he was arrested. He changed. He became irritable, secretive. Linda pretended to be fine, but I could see the bruises she was trying to hide. Rivera tensed up. Had she been abused? She never admitted it, said she fell or hit herself. Classic excuses, you know? And now he's back, and everyone's pretending he's a hero, a victim of the system. What if... Sarah didn't finish. Do you think he's a danger to her? I don't know, Sarah almost shouted, then added quietly. Just keep an eye on her, okay? She won't listen to anyone. She's so happy he's back. When Sarah left, Rivera sat for a long time looking out the window at the busy Houston street. He remembered Robert's eyes in the courtroom, his smile that didn't make him feel any warmer. Maybe it was just a professional deformity that made him see a threat where none existed. Or was the intuition that had saved him more than once sounding the alarm again? Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. A week after Robert's release, Linda organized a small party at their renovated house, a modest one-story structure in a quiet suburb. Friends, Linda's schoolmates, journalists, and Frank Harris, the lawyer who had gotten the case overturned, all gathered to celebrate. Rivera received an invitation, which surprised him. He was the last to arrive, feeling out of place amidst all the fun. Linda saw him and came over with 2 glasses of lemonade. Detective, I'm glad you came, she said, handing him a drink. Get to know Robert for real, not through police reports. She motioned him over to her husband, who was talking to Frank Harris, a short, balding man with shrewd eyes. Robert, this is Detective Rivera. He's interested in your case. Robert turned, and his eyes narrowed for a moment. Then he smiled and held out his hand. "Nice to meet you, Detective. Linda mentioned you." The handshake was firm. Too firm. Rivera felt Robert's fingers clench tighter than necessary. "Congratulations on your release," Rivera said. "It must have been hard these past 3 years." "It has," Robert nodded. "But I'm home now with a wife who never stopped believing in me. That's all that matters." There was indeed a birthmark on his neck, small, brownish, almost at the collar of his shirt, the same one Linda was talking about. "You're probably looking for a job right now, aren't you?" Rivera asked. "Oh, that's already decided," Robert replied. "An old friend of mine has offered me a position with his construction company. I start on Monday." "Robert has always been a handyman," Linda said proudly, snuggling up to her husband. "In prison, he helped with the repairs." "I had to pass the time," Robert said nonchalantly, but his gaze lingered on his wife's face with an uncertain expression. The party continued. Rivera watched the couple from a distance. They looked happy, but something about their interaction seemed unnatural. Linda was constantly looking for approval in her husband's eyes, and he kept his hand on her shoulder as if he was afraid she might disappear. Frank Harris approached Rivera with a glass of whiskey. "I didn't expect to see the police here," said the lawyer, looking the detective over from head to toe. "I'm here unofficially," Rivera replied. "Good job with the appeal." "Thanks," Harris nodded. Although, to be honest, it was Linda who did the bulk of the work. I've never seen such determination. She turned over every rock, checked every lead. Sometimes I think she'd make a great lawyer. "Or a detective," Rivera added. "Tell me, do you believe he's innocent?" Harris was silent for a moment, then answered quietly, "I believe in the justice system. If the court has found the evidence sufficient to warrant release, then so be it." The answer was evasive, and Rivera noticed it. "But you have doubts?" No, Harris objected hastily. "It's just that, sometimes we lawyers don't ask too many questions. My job is to represent my client's interest within the law, that's all." The evening was coming to an end. The guests were slowly leaving, congratulating the happy couple. Rivera was about to leave when he noticed Linda escorting the last of the guests to the door. Robert was nowhere to be seen. The detective decided to seize the moment and walked quietly down the hallway. The door to one of the rooms was ajar. Rivera peeked in and saw Robert standing in front of a mirror. The expression on his face had changed completely. It had become hard, almost predatory. He stared at his reflection with such cold anger that it sent shivers down Rivera's spine. "Detective?" Linda's voice behind him made him flinch. "Are you looking for something?" "No, I'm sorry," Rivera replied. "I wanted to say goodbye to both of you." Robert left the room again with a smile on his face. "Leaving already? That's a shame. It was nice to meet you." He put his arm around Linda's shoulders. "Wasn't it, dear?" "Yes," Linda nodded, but Rivera noticed how her shoulders tensed under her husband's arm. "Thank you for coming, Detective." Already in the car, Rivera sat for a long time without starting the engine. Something was wrong in this house, in this couple, in this story. He looked at the lighted windows of the Coleman house. In one of them, he saw the silhouettes of the couple. They stood close to each other, and from the outside, it might have looked like they were embracing. But Rivera was too experienced a cop not to notice. What he saw looked more like a confrontation. The sharp ringing of the phone snapped Max Rivera out of a deep sleep. He fumbled for his cell phone on the bedside table and looked at the screen. 3 hours and 42 minutes past midnight. "Rivera," he said hoarsely, still trying to wake up. "Detective, we have a homicide." The dispatcher's voice sounded tense. "Malibu Lane 12. Uniforms are already on the scene, but they're requesting you personally." Rivera sat up abruptly on the bed. "Malibu Lane 12, Coleman residence." "Who's the victim?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "Linda Coleman, 32 years old. Husband was missing from the crime scene." Rivera felt a cold lump form in his chest. He'd tried to warn, tried to follow up, but it had been 3 months. Everything seemed normal, and he'd backed off. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he replied, disconnecting. The night was cool for a Texas summer. Rivera drove the car through the empty streets, mentally cursing himself. Since Robert's release party, he had stopped by the Coleman's house several times on various pretexts. Linda had always been friendly, Robert wary. The last visit had been a month ago. Rivera had brought Linda an article about her campaign to free her husband, published in a law journal. She looked tired, but happy. "We're getting our lives together," she said then. "Robert got a promotion. Things are good." And now, the approach to the Coleman house was blocked by police cars with blinkers. Neighbors, despite the late hour, crowded behind the yellow tape of the cordon, whispering and filming what was happening on their phones. Rivera parked, showed his badge to the officer at the tape, and walked to the house. Patrolman Garcia, a young Hispanic cop, met him on the porch. "Detective, thank you for coming so quickly," Garcia said. "We knew you were interested in this family." "What happened here?" Rivera interrupted him, putting on latex gloves. A neighbor, Ellen Porter, heard the screams around 2 a.m. She didn't think much of it at first, said the couple had been fighting a lot lately, but then there was the sound of breaking glass and a loud bang. She called 911. Patrol arrived 12 minutes later. The door was locked. They saw the body through the living room window. They had to kick the door in. Rivera took a deep breath and entered the house. The smell of blood hit his nostrils immediately. The living room, where Robert's release had been celebrated months ago, was now a crime scene. Linda was lying on the floor in front of the couch with her arms spread out. She was wearing a nightgown soaked with blood in the chest area. A table lamp with a broken leg was lying nearby. Obviously, she had tried to defend herself. Shards of a broken window dotted the floor. "Murder weapon?" Rivera asked, not taking his eyes off the body. "A knife from the kitchen set. We found it in the sink. Looks like the killer was trying to wash the blood off, but he was in a hurry." Rivera took a good look around the room. There were signs of struggle everywhere. An overturned coffee table, books thrown off the shelves, a broken vase. She'd fought back. "Time of death?" "Preliminarily between 2 o'clock and 3 a.m., the medical examiner said, rising from his knees. "Multiple stab wounds to the chest area. Death was caused by blood loss and damage to vital organs. Any signs of sexual assault? No. This was pure homicidal aggression." Rivera nodded and went into the kitchen. It was a mess here too. Drawers pulled out, open cabinets. He looked in the sink. The knife was indeed there, with remnants of caked blood on the blade and handle. "Look for prints everywhere," he ordered, "especially on the knife and the doorknobs. What about the back door?" "It's open. Looks like the killer went out that way." Rivera returned to the living room and noticed Linda's cell phone on the table. The screen was smashed, but the device still worked. Rivera put on a fresh pair of gloves and picked up the phone. The last outgoing call had been made at 23:58, almost 2 hours before the estimated time of the murder. The call was to Sarah Johnson, Linda's friend, and lasted 7 minutes. "We need to question this Sarah," Rivera told the officer, recording his instructions. "And all the neighbors. Has anyone seen Robert tonight?" "Neighbor across the street says she saw him leave in his pickup truck around 10 o'clock at night. Looked angry, slammed the car door. Did he come back? Nobody saw him." Rivera walked slowly toward the bedroom. The bed was disassembled but not crumpled. It had clearly not been slept in tonight. On the bedside table at Linda's side was a picture of a young couple, apparently their wedding photo, and a glass of water. Rivera opened the top drawer of the nightstand. Inside were the usual things: a charger, a book, a pack of tissues, and a thick leather-bound notebook. He pulled it out and opened it to the first page. Linda Coleman's diary, begun May 15, 2024. That was the date of Robert's release. Rivera flipped a few pages. May 21st. Robert is still getting used to freedom. Sometimes wakes up in the night in a cold sweat. Says he dreams about the cell. I hold his hand until he calms down. During the day he smiles, talks to his neighbors, but I can see that something has changed inside him. Prison changes people. I've been reading about it, preparing myself. We just have to give him time. Rivera thumbed further. June 3rd. We had a fight today. First real scandal since his return. I wanted to invite my friends over for dinner, but Robert made a scene. Said they all betrayed him when he was sitting down. Screamed so loud the neighbors must have heard. Then he apologized, cried on my shoulder. I understand his pain, I really do. The next entry was dated June 15th. I can't believe it's only been a month. It feels like a lifetime. Robert, he's not the man I've been fighting for 3 years. Today he saw a check made out to Frank for legal fees. He interrogated me, accused me of having an affair with a lawyer, broke my favorite vase. I've never seen him like that. When I tried to leave, he grabbed my arm so hard it left bruises. Then, of course, he apologized, said he loved me. Maybe I should talk to a counselor, not for myself, for both of us. The notes grew more and more disturbing. 3rd of July. I'm afraid to fall asleep in my own house. Robert sits in the kitchen for hours at night, just staring into the darkness. When I ask him what's wrong, he snaps at me. Came home drunk today, talking to himself in the bathroom. Something about, she's about to find out the truth. I don't know what to do. The last entry was dated yesterday afternoon, August 13th. I can't live like this anymore. I'll talk to Sarah tomorrow, need to move in with her temporarily. I'll find a psychologist for Robert, maybe therapy will help him. I still love him, but that man. Sometimes I feel like it's not my Robert back from prison. Yesterday I found a strange note in the garage with some numbers on it. Looks like an account number. When I asked, he ripped the paper out of my hands, told me to stay out of his business. I don't feel safe anymore. Rivera closed the journal and carefully placed it in the evidence bag. His heart beat heavily in his chest. Linda had a premonition of danger, but it was too late. He returned to the living room where the forensics team continued their work. Check Mr. Coleman's phone records for the last 24 hours and find Sarah Johnson immediately. She may know where he's headed. At that moment, one of the officers shouted from the bedroom, "Detective, I think you should see this." Rivera quickly returned. The officer was holding a small bag found under the mattress. "It's a plane ticket, 1 ticket to Mexico City. The flight leaves at 5 o'clock this morning." Rivera glanced at his watch, 4:20. If Robert was headed for the airport, they didn't have much time left. "Put out a bolo immediately," he commanded. "Male, Caucasian, 35 years old, approximately 5 feet tall, dark hair, birthmark on neck. Probably driving a blue Ford F-150 pickup, Texas license plate." He stammered, not knowing the license plate number. "We got one." Garcia picked it up. "A neighbor wrote it down when he almost hit her cat last week. Tell all patrols in the airport. He's armed and dangerous." By the time Rivera got to the porch, it was starting to get light. Television vans were pulling up one after another. The news of the murder of the woman who had secured her husband's release promised to be a sensation. He saw a crying Sarah brought straight here for questioning. "I called her yesterday," she whispered. "Linda said she was afraid, that Robert was changing in front of her eyes, but I couldn't imagine." "What exactly did she say?" Rivera asked. "It's important." "She said she found some papers in his desk, something to do with their house and the insurance on her life. She wanted to look into it. I offered to let her sleep over, but she said no, said she wanted to talk to him straight first." Rivera sighed. Typical, the victim believing until the last minute that she could make things right by talking. His cell phone rang. Detective? This is Officer Thompson from Patrol. We just found a blue pickup matching the description abandoned in a parking lot at the Oasis Mall 5 kilometers from the Coleman's house." "He's switching transportation," Rivera muttered. "Smart. Cordon off the parking lot, check all the security cameras. He can't have gotten far." After hanging up, Rivera turned to Sarah. "Did you ever hear Robert mention backup plans? Places he could have gone?" Sarah shook her head. "No, but..." she stammered. "What?" "Robert had a friend. They were sitting together. When Robert came out, this friend came to visit them several times. Linda didn't like him, said he was some kind of threat. His name was Eddie. I don't know his last name." Rivera nodded and handed the information to an officer for verification. The phone rang again in his pocket. This time, it was Frank Harris calling. "Detective? I just heard the news. Is it true? Linda's been murdered?" "Unfortunately, yes," Rivera answered. "Mr. Harris, now is not the time." "There's something you should know," the lawyer interrupted him. "Linda came to my office yesterday. She found some strange documents among Robert's things, an insurance policy on her life for $500,000, taken out 2 weeks ago, and something else related to real estate. She was scared, asking about the legal ramifications." Rivera froze. "And what did you tell her?" "Advised her to leave the house immediately and file for divorce." Harris's voice trembled. "She said she wanted to talk to him first. I should have insisted." "It's not your fault," Rivera replied automatically, though inside he was seething with anger. So many signals, and no one took them seriously. "Do you know anything about his possible whereabouts?" "No, but—" Harris was silent for a second. "In a gas station robbery case, in mitigation, Robert said he was under the influence of an accomplice, one Edward Malone. Maybe he went to him." "Wait." Rivera felt the blood drain from his face. "Did you say in a robbery case?" "But Robert was found not guilty." "In the last hearing, yes, but originally. He originally pleaded guilty, Detective, partially. Said he was there, but he didn't shoot. That was before Linda started her campaign. Then he changed his statement, claimed total innocence." Rivera felt the puzzle starting to come together. "Did you defend him at his first trial?" "No, Linda hired me for the appeal." "And did you tell her about this initial confession?" The silence on the phone was eloquent enough. "Mr. Harris?" "No," the lawyer finally answered. "She was so sure of his innocence, so devoted to him. I thought he might have confessed under duress. It happens all the time. And then there was new evidence of his alibi. And it didn't matter." Rivera closed his eyes. The story was getting clearer and scarier. Linda had won her battle to free her husband without knowing that he had initially admitted his guilt. And then she may have discovered the truth, along with a life insurance policy in her own name. "Thank you for the information," Rivera said dryly. "We'll contact you if we need an official statement." He disconnected and immediately dialed the number of the officer coordinating the search. "Check Edward Malone's address and put out an APB to all patrols. Robert Coleman is a suspect in the murder of his wife and must not leave the state." The morning sun had already fully risen, illuminating the crime scene with a merciless light. The coroner's car pulled up to pick up Linda's body. Rivera watched it being loaded into a black bag and thought about the woman who believed so much in justice, fought so hard for her husband. A woman whose faith had cost her her life. 36 hours without sleep was taking its toll. Rivera sat in his office, piled up with papers, a third cup of coffee in his hand. On the whiteboard across from him were pictures of Linda and Robert Coleman on the day of their release, the crime scene, a map with possible escape routes marked. There was a knock on the door. A young Officer Garcia peered into the office. "Detective, forensics sent over the preliminary report. All the prints on the knife belonged to Robert Coleman. Confirmed through the database, they were left over from his first arrest." Rivera nodded. "Anything from Malone?" "Edward Malone was paroled 4 months ago. His last known address was a rented apartment in San Antonio, but he moved out 3 weeks ago. Neighbors say a man in a blue pickup truck visited him often." "Robert," Rivera muttered. "They kept in touch." "One more thing," Garcia put a printout on the table. "We checked the Coleman's financial records. Robert did indeed take out a life insurance policy on Linda's life almost immediately after his release. $500,000. And 2 weeks ago, he withdrew almost all the money from their joint account, $24,000. Rivera rubbed his temples. The picture was becoming clearer and clearer. A planned murder for money. The car? The pickup's still in the mall parking lot. We canvassed cab and ride-share drivers. One of them identified Robert's photo, drove a man of similar appearance from the mall to the Austin bus station early yesterday morning. Rivera jumped up from his chair. "What buses were leaving Austin yesterday morning?" "Already checked," Garcia nodded. "Flights to Dallas, San Antonio, El Paso, and Houston. Cameras at the station showed a man who looked like Robert boarding a bus to El Paso. From there, it's a short walk to the Mexican border." "He's trying to leave the country," Rivera grabbed his jacket. "Set up roadblocks on all the roads to the border, and call the El Paso PD to check the bus station and all the motels in the area." "Already done, sir. The bus arrived in El Paso 3 hours ago. Local police are searching, but so far no luck. Rivera's frozen in place." 3 hours ago? So he could have crossed the border by now. "It's possible," Garcia agreed. "But there's something else. We checked Robert's cell phone records for the last week. Frequent calls to one number in the Marfa area, a small town about 200 kilometers east of El Paso. The number's registered to a company called Desert Vacation, owns a motel." "He could be headed there." Rivera took the car keys. "I'm going to Marfa." "Sir, that's an 8-hour drive." "Then I'll be there by tonight." Rivera said. "Contact the local sheriff. Let him know I'm coming. And be careful. If Coleman's there, don't spook him. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk." Rivera drove the 800 kilometers to Marfa almost non-stop, swapping driving with Garcia, who volunteered to accompany him. The desert landscape of West Texas was replaced by monotonous miles of highway. In the car, they listened to the news. The story of Linda and Robert was the top story on the national channels. "Freedman killed his rescuer," the headline screamed. They arrived in Marfa at dusk. It was a typical small Texas town. A few streets, a water tower, and a Spanish colonial-style city hall. Sheriff Ray Dawson, a stocky man with a graying mustache, met them at the local police station. "Detective Rivera? Pleased to meet you, although the circumstances aren't the most pleasant." He shook his hand firmly. "We checked out this motel, the Desert Shelter, located 15 kilometers out of town on an old highway. The owner, Tom Wilcox, says no one resembling your sketch has checked in recent days." "And Malone?" Rivera asked. "Edward Malone?" "Not either. But there is one oddity. 3 weeks ago, Wilcox leased one of the detached cottages on the outskirts of his property on a long-term lease. Tenant paid in cash, identified himself as John Smith." "Very original," Garcia chuckled. "Can we take a look at the cottage?" Rivera asked. "Sure," the sheriff nodded. "I've already sent 2 deputies down there to keep watch. No movement yet." They drove out of town on a deserted road. The Desert Shelter turned out to be a typical roadside motel, a one-story U-shaped building with a sign made of neon tubes, half of which didn't work. Behind the main building, several individual cottages could be seen, scattered among cacti and dusty shrubs. Rivera, Garcia, and the sheriff met the deputies watching the last cottage from a safe distance. "The lights are on inside," one of them reported. "The curtains are drawn, but occasionally a shadow can be seen. Someone is definitely there." "A car?" Rivera asked. "Old Chevy behind the house. Paperwork says it belongs to one Frank Dawson. Checked it out. That man died 5 years ago." "Fake papers," Rivera nodded. "How many entrances to the cottage?" "Only 2, the front door and the back door. The windows are small, so a man couldn't fit through," Rivera thought. "If Robert's inside, he could be armed and desperate. A direct assault is risky." "There's a better idea," the sheriff said. "Wilcox, the motel owner, usually delivers dinner to the cottage guests himself. He could—" "No," Rivera interrupted. "Too dangerous for a civilian." "Then I can do it," Garcia suggested. "I'll change clothes, deliver dinner, and check to see who's inside." Rivera hesitated. The plan was risky, but better than a direct assault. "Okay, but you're only identifying the suspect. If it's Coleman, you pull back immediately and we call for backup." The plan was put into motion quickly. Garcia changed into his motel employee uniform, grabbed a tray of dinner, and headed toward the cottage. The others took up positions, ready to intervene at the first sign of danger. Rivera watched tensely as Garcia knocked on the door. After a moment it opened, but from the angle of observation, Rivera could not make out the face of the man inside. Garcia said something, held out a tray, and suddenly recoiled sharply as a hand with a gun peeked out of the doorway. A gunshot rang out. "Garcia!" Rivera shouted, grabbing the weapon. The young officer fell to the ground, clutching his shoulder. The figure of a man appeared in the doorway, aiming for a second shot. Rivera fired first. The bullet hit the door jamb, causing the gunman to dive back into the house. "Officer down!" the sheriff yelled into the radio. "We need an ambulance and backup." Rivera ran over to Garcia. The wound wasn't fatal. The bullet had gone through the fleshy part of his shoulder. "It's him," Garcia whispered, wincing in pain. "Coleman, hold on, boy." Rivera helped him crawl to safety, where sheriff's deputies administered first aid. Meanwhile, the sounds of breaking glass came from the cottage. "He's trying to escape through the window," yelled one of the deputies. Rivera rushed around the house. In the light of the streetlights, he saw Robert Coleman squeezing through the small bathroom window. Seeing the detective, Robert fired another shot, but missed. "Police! Drop the gun!" yelled Rivera, aiming at the fugitive. Robert jumped to the ground and sprinted toward the old Chevy behind the house. Rivera shot into the air. "Last warning, Coleman!" Robert froze, then slowly turned around. His face looked drained in the spotlight, but cold determination burned in his eyes. "Ah, Detective Rivera," he said almost calmly. "You've always been too curious, haven't you? Drop the gun and put your hands up," Rivera commanded, holding Robert at gunpoint. "There's nowhere for you to run." Robert grinned. You know, that's what she thought too, that I had nowhere to run, that I should be grateful to her for the rest of my life. "I saved you, Robert. I fought for you." I heard it every single day. Gun, on the ground, now. "And you know what the funny thing is?" Robert continued, ignoring the command. "She really believed I was innocent. Even when she found those documents, even when she started to suspect, she wanted to come clean, like it would make a difference." "You killed her for insurance?" Rivera asked, slowly approaching. Robert laughed. "Money is a nice bonus, but no, Detective, I killed her because she deserved it." "Deserved it?" Rivera felt a wave of anger rising inside. "She fought for you for 3 years." "Yes, she did. After she refused to give me an alibi from the beginning." Robert's eyes darkened. "I begged her to say I was with her that night. But righteous Linda couldn't lie. It's not right, Robert. I can't lie under oath. So I went to jail." Something clicked in Rivera's head. "You did commit that robbery," he pronounced. "With Malone." "Of course," Robert shrugged, as if it were obvious. "We'd been planning it for months, and it would have gone smoothly if that idiot cashier hadn't gone for his gun." Malone panicked and fired. "And then you came up with the story about the hotel in Austin." "Not right away," Robert smirked. "I gave up first. I thought I'd get a couple years if I cooperated, but when I found out I was looking at a tenor..." He shook his head. "Prison's a lot of thinking time, Detective. I thought of every detail. I got Malone to contact Linda, give her the hotel idea. We bribed the bartender, forged the records." "And she believed it," Rivera said quietly. "Oh yes, she did." Robert's eyes sparkled. "My faithful Linda. She tried so hard to make it up to me for not giving me an alibi. Spent her life savings on lawyers, put her reputation on the line. So I figured, let her win this battle. And then she'll know she saved the monster." A chill ran down Rivera's spine. All these months of investigation, he felt that something was wrong, but the reality was scarier than any suspicion. "You planned this from the beginning," he said. "The release, the insurance, the murder." "The first few weeks after I got out, I was still hesitant," Robert admitted. "Thought maybe I'd just disappear with the money. But then she started digging for the truth. Found my records, my insurance papers, called Harris." His face contorted with rage. "She should have just stayed a grateful fool." "And where's Malone?" Rivera asked, trying to buy time. The sirens of reinforcements could already be heard in the distance. "Oh, Eddie?" Robert smiled, and that smile made Rivera shudder inwardly. He had become an unnecessary witness. "Look in the desert 100 kilometers from here. I can even show you the place if you make me a good offer." Rivera realized he wasn't just facing a killer, but a cold-blooded, calculating sociopath. "Robert Coleman, you are under arrest for the murder of Linda Coleman and Edward Malone," Rivera said formally. "Drop your weapon and get down on the ground." The sirens sounded very close by. Robert looked around, realizing he was surrounded. A strange mixture of disappointment and relief flashed across his face. "You know, Detective," he said thoughtfully, "my father always said, a plan is only as good as the moment it goes wrong. I'm almost there." For a split second, Rivera saw Robert's gun hand twitch and instinctively pulled the trigger. The shot echoed across the desert. Robert fell on his back, dropping the weapon. The bullet hit his shoulder, just as his bullet had wounded Garcia. "You win, Detective," Robert whispered, as Rivera walked over to cuff him. "But you know what's funny? Linda died believing in my innocence. It's almost, poetic, don't you think?" Rivera turned him sharply onto his stomach, snapping the handcuffs back on. "Linda died starting to realize the truth. And you're going to spend the rest of your life in a cell, knowing that your perfect plan failed." A police helicopter circled in the sky above the desert, its searchlight illuminating the scene of the arrest. Sheriff's deputies and arriving backup surrounded Robert, lifting him to his feet. An ambulance was taking Garcia away, whose wound was fortunately not dangerous. Rivera stood back, watching as Robert was put into the police car. There was an emptiness inside, Not the triumph, not the satisfaction of having caught a criminal, but simply the heavy realization of a tragedy that could not be prevented. Sheriff Dawson approached him. "Good work, Detective. It's not every day we catch a sneaky bastard like that." "Too late for Linda," Rivera replied grimly. "Yeah," the sheriff agreed, "but justice will be served. And if what he said about Malone is true, we'll find the body." Rivera nodded. "Coleman's got nothing to lose. He'll confess anything to brag about his genius." "I've seen a lot of those in my career," Dawson sighed. "They think they're smarter than everyone else, that their plan is perfect. They end up behind bars for the rest of their lives." Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. A week later, Rivera stood at Linda Coleman's grave. The funeral had been held 2 days ago, a modest ceremony attended mostly by co-workers from school, Sarah, a few friends, and reporters hungry for dramatic footage. Now only flowers and a framed photo of a smiling woman remain on the grave. Robert had fully confessed to the murders of Linda and Malone, even recounting the details with a kind of perverse pleasure. Malone's body was found where Robert had indicated, in the desert, in a shallow grave. According to the preliminary version, Robert killed him to get rid of an accomplice who knew too much and could interfere with his revenge plan. Detective?" Sarah's voice brought him out of his reverie. She approached with a bouquet of white lilies. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I wanted to say goodbye," Rivera replied, "and to apologize." "For what?" "You did your best." "Not enough," Rivera shook his head. "I sensed something was wrong from the beginning. I should have dug deeper, insisted on protecting Linda." Sarah put the flowers on the grave and said quietly, "You know, Linda was stubborn. Even if you tried to intervene, she wouldn't listen. She always trusted people, believed in them. That was her strength, and her weakness." They stood in silence, looking at the photograph of a woman who fought for justice and became a victim of her own faith. "What will happen to Robert?" Sarah finally asked. "The district attorney is seeking the death penalty," Rivera replied. "2 premeditated murders, one of them particularly brutal. He has little chance of avoiding the maximum sentence." "Will that bring Linda back?" "No," Rivera answered honestly. "But it's the best the justice system can do." As they left the cemetery, Rivera looked back one last time at the grave of the woman whose story he couldn't change. In his pocket was a notebook with notes on a new case. Life went on, crime was not waiting. But he knew that Linda Coleman's story would stay with him forever, as a reminder that sometimes the greatest danger comes from those we love most, and that blind faith can cost lives. "Take care of yourself, Sarah," he said goodbye. "I thank you for trying to warn us." She nodded, and they went their separate ways under the grayish Texas sky, where storm clouds were gathering in the distance.